Välkomna till Se människan-scenen. Dagens sista programpunkt, Vårt behov av historiska romaner. Och det är författaren Conn Iggulden som samtalar med biskop emeritus Martin Lind. Varsågoda, välkomna.
Thank you.
Thank you, and most welcome, Conn Iggulden, to our our scene here, Church of Sweden stage in the book fair. You have written quite a number of books on the theme of historical novels, and
yes.
one of your latest one is now translated into Swedish. This one, it's written about the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century.
Yes.
So. Why did you write about that period?
Although I am English and Irish, I wasn't trying to find an English story. I was seeking a good story. I found it first with Julius Caesar, where I read a piece about Octavian, his grandnephew, throwing the heads of Julius Caesar's assassins at the foot of his statue in Rome. And I knew there were 23 assassins, and well, you can't carry 23, so I assumed it was some sort of pyramid arrangement or that he did relays. Either way, I was interested in the relationship that would allow someone to do that, and it's moments like that, events like that, characters and relationships like that that I look for. With Genghis Khan, he was abandoned and left to die in a very hostile climate, down to minus 40 degrees, and he survived and went on to rule the entire country, and his grandson was the emperor of China, and that makes it the greatest rags to riches in human history. So with Wars of the Roses, it wasn't simply that the first battle took place about 5 miles from my house, although that is true.
Oh, it did?
Yes. Well, yes, but that is honestly just a coincidence. It is to do with the characters. And what you have from 1455 to 1485 is a constant spiral of struggle, becoming more and more, darker and darker, more and more vicious as fathers are killed and then sons are killed and brothers and families torn apart and so on. So it's an extraordinary story because you have Lancaster and York, and in the beginning it's almost fairly civilized. There are very small armies, and it can stop at any moment, and one side wins and one side loses, and it's relatively dignified, and nobody's lost someone they love. And then piece by piece, they spiral and get torn apart over the next 30 years, until you have climaxes like the Battle of Towton, which involved 50 to 80,000 men, and they fought all day and continued to fight in the night, because at that point there were 2 kings of England, and they could not leave the battlefield until there was one. So that sort of violent outpouring is a climax. It's wonderful material for a storyteller, because you only have to walk the fields and imagine it being fought in snow for hour after hour after hour. Nobody fought in the winter, but they did at that time because they had 2 kings, and they had to finish it in December. So I chose that because the story is extraordinary, and that's what you always look for with historical fiction: the best stories with dates.
You're right, very gripping, I would say, very absolutely exciting and thrilling. So I'm not really a reader of historical novel, I won't say, but when I read your book here in the Swedish translation, I found it very thrilling, really exciting. But you've chosen a weak king as your major figure,
yes.
Haven't you? Henry VI.
That was a difficult choice, because I started with Julius Caesar, who was an extraordinary dominant character and very intelligent and so on, and who wrote his own histories, which is a great trick if you can ever do that. And then Genghis Khan, who was illiterate and failed to write his own history, so Julius Caesar became a great hero and Genghis Khan became a great monster. The lesson there is, again, to write your own histories. But where was I going with that? What was this is where I get tired, ladies and gentlemen.
The weak king, yes.
The weak king, Henry. Thank you. Henry VI, on the other hand, was in some ways, he fascinated me because he was the opposite. I didn't want to write Attila the Hun or another very dominant character who went on to create an empire, another Alexander the Great. Henry VI was an absence. He had almost no character. His defining characteristic is that if you could get into a room with him and ask him for something, he would give it to you if it was in his power, anything you wanted. And that made him incredibly dangerous, because it meant that anyone who could reach him could get what they wanted. And it meant that in the absence of power, everyone else around him became powerful. particularly his cousins, the House of York, because they had Richard, Duke of York, who was not a weak man, who did not spend a third of his life at prayer, who did not go off into dazes and stare off into nothing, who didn't have physical collapses that lasted at one point for 18 months, where he wasn't responding to any stimuli, where he couldn't feel pain, didn't recognize his own baby son when it was shown to him. And Richard, Duke of York, only really came to power because Henry was so weak. And that was not only fascinating for me as a writer, but it was very different to anything I'd tried to do before. In a way, this was more the story of Margaret of Anjou, his wife who tried to protect Henry VI, instead of another dominant male, you know, making an empire.
He was very sick, and he was ill, and he was absent, and he was sometimes 18 months away from power, and so forth. But he was also very pious in your novel. Is that your own fantasy, or is that really historically true?
It is recorded that he spent a third of his life at prayer, and as you will know, we spend a third of our life asleep. So, you know, the rest of the time must include some eating, and there was very little of his life, therefore, that he wasn't involved in one of those two things. No, he was known to be a pious man, and he's really only famous for starting Eton School.
And he started Eton School?
He started Eton. If you ever go into Eton, there is a statue of Henry VI, and all of the boys walk to the right of him, which is his left, because they walk closest to King Henry VI's heart, which is just is a nice thing. But apart from starting Eton, and I think King's College, Cambridge, apart from those two, he achieved nothing except the ruination of his realm and the loss of France and the complete destruction of the Civil War in England that stretched for 30 years and ruined a generation. And so he is an absolute disaster as a king. And it was because he didn't have the strength. And we don't know what his illness was. There is no coma state that lasts for months and months at a time. It had to have been some sort of mental illness. It had to have been some sort of depression. Because he didn't starve to death. If you are in a coma for 18 months and they can't force feed you, which they couldn't, then he would have starved to death. So it wasn't a coma. He is meant to have spoken to a few people during this 18 months of catatonic lack of awareness. He had no memory of it when he came out of it. He came out of it on Christmas Day 1454. After 18 months, with the Christmas bells ringing out, he became aware again. He came back to himself, and he discovered that York had become the protector and defender of the realm, that this cousin of his had stepped into the breach, had become powerful in his absence, and he was furious. For a little time, for just a short while, he was strong enough to throw York out and to regain his position. And that was very much the engine of the Wars of the Roses, a weak king who came back at the wrong time and tried to enforce his will and failed.
Absolutely. If I should be personal with you, I would say that the king, of course, is the main figure in your novel, but for me, his wife is even more interesting.
She is.
Margaret of Anjou, a French girl who comes into the picture, becomes the Queen of England, actually.
Yes.
And
at 15.
as you say, there are lots of other powers, because he is so weak. There are other families coming up and wanting to take the power. But in a way, also his very young wife, Queen Margaret, tries to take some power, influence, and the role of her is rather interesting, isn't it?
She had to grow up very quickly indeed. I mean, the reason she was chosen is because the French king would not give any sisters, daughters, or relatives to the English king. They tried that. His father had given a daughter, and the result was that Henry V claimed all of France as his own. They were never going to do that again. That meant that if the English royal family wanted a French princess, which for some reason they decided was the only possibility, they had to go for the only other princess in France that existed. And that was because her father was a man called René of Anjou. And he claimed to be the king of Sicily, Naples, and Jerusalem. He spent most of his life trying to enforce those claims and failing and getting put into a prison cell and then held for ransom and begging his family to pay for his own ransom. But it did mean that if he was technically, at least on paper, a king, then his daughter was technically, on paper, a princess. And so she was the only unmarried princess in France who was possible. And so they brought her to England. She was married technically first in France to a man standing in for King Henry VI because they couldn't bring poor old Henry to France. As soon as the French realized that he was weak, then they would have started blowing trumpets and talking about invasion. So they sent William de la Pole, who was 47 years old, who was already married, and he was the one who put the ring on Margaret's finger again when she was 15 and said the vows on Henry's behalf. If you're king, you can do this sort of thing, apparently. Just to set it in the historical period, William de la Pole, the man who married Margaret of Anjou the first time, was married to Alice Chaucer, who was the granddaughter of Geoffrey Chaucer. So that's the historical period we're talking about. And then when Margaret came to England, she was 15. For the first time, she saw her husband for the first time on the marriage day. And of course, you can imagine how a 15-year-old girl marrying the King of England, what she must have expected.
Absolutely.
And what she found instead was a man who desperately needed her to look after him, and it was not what she had planned at all. And her life is tragic, in truly sort of Shakespearean historic epic terms. It's tragic. She had a husband and a son to look after, and she very nearly managed it. I mean, her enemies, one by one, she managed to bring them down, but in doing so, she unleashed their sons. And the problem was that some of their sons, as you go into that spiral of civil war getting more and more brutal, the sons were more callous and more vicious and less willing to offer dignity in their victories, and she unleashed an absolute storm.
So in a way, she's the main figure here. I mean, the book in America is called Margaret of Anjou.
Yes, I mean, she is, this is very much her story because of Henry's absence, which suits me, as I say, because I didn't want to write another man makes empire sort of a story. But the extraordinary thing, the aim for historical fiction always is that people start to care about the characters, that you want desperately that if something awful happens to the characters, that they feel their victories and despair with them when they despair. And Margaret has such wonderful ups and downs from a plot point of view. She has the greatest victories, followed by complete disaster, followed by pulling it all back together and winning again, that, you'd have to have a heart of stone not to sympathize with her. And, she's been an absolute joy to write about.
Actually, there's 4 pages in the book, in the Swedish translation at least. There's 4 pages where 2 women are speaking with each other. The Queen Mary,
I know what you're going to say,
who is from Portuguese origin. She's Queen of Scotland.
Yes.
And she meets Queen Margaret from England, who actually is a French origin.
Yes.
And they don't know each other. They never met before, actually. And the Mary is a widow, and Margaret, her husband is ill and sleeping or whatever, and absent. But they meet, and they are a little afraid of each other, but rather soon they become friends.
Yes.
And you have 4 pages of absolute fantastic naked friendship between them, I would say. The best pages, in my view, are these 4 pages. And in a way, the existential way of their relationship is so marvelously written here. Are you influenced by the women here when you write it?
Well, yes, I mean, that's a perfect example of some of the difficulties of historical fiction, but if you get it right, it works beautifully. We know historically that when Margaret of Anjou had suffered a great reverse, she went to Wales and spoke to the Tudors, and then she went north into Scotland and she met Mary of Guelders, and they did get on very well. Mary of Guelders had recently lost her husband, and Margaret had recently had her husband kidnapped and taken away by his enemies. So they had very much a shared background. Also, as you say, Margaret of Anjou was French and Mary of Guelders, was it Portuguese? So they were both foreign queens in Britain. And they got on well enough to hammer out in a very short time an arrangement for Margaret of Anjou to borrow the Scottish army. And she borrowed, I think it was up to 3,000 great hairy Scotsmen to come down and help her. And in return, she promised a town that was on the borders, and sometimes Scottish, sometimes English, called Berwick-upon-Tweed. And she promised that to them and betrothed her daughter, to the young son who would one day be King of Scotland. None of this worked out very well in the end because her life was to be more of a disaster than she'd hoped. But when you come across a scene like that, you don't know the actual conversation that they had. All you know is what they intended and what the result was. So then you have to write the conversation, and I'm really pleased to hear it worked, because it's a joy when you think you've got it right. But there'll always be, with historical fiction, you must always fill some gaps. Because no one knows what was said in a private room.
Of course, yes. I'm a little disturbed, I must tell you, that you have 59 names in the index of persons. 59! whereof 6 are women.
Right.
Why only 6, my friend?
Well, oh dear. I can't without checking the numbers. I suppose because if Margaret of Anjou if she's the main female lead in it, then I didn't necessarily need to bring in too many other main characters who were women. I mean, as I said, I've just realised I passed is it the Bechdel test? The famous internet test of any film, which is there a scene where one woman is talking to another and it's not about men? And I think, I'm not certain, but I think those 4 pages you mentioned pretty much cover me on that one. Which
Absolutely,
is,
absolutely.
So
that's true. That's much true, yes.
So I'll take that and just rest on my laurels in that area. Thank you.
Very good.
But obviously it is worth pointing out that in the 15th century, the various men were... I mean, for example, Richard, Duke of York, was not only a war leader and was expected to command men in battle in France or in England or wherever was necessary for his king, but he also had to run about 30-odd estates. And he was actually an extraordinary a micromanager. I mean, I once sat through for about 2 days and read his written reports for 1 week of his early years. And the amount of detail that he was involved in was... well, honestly, incredibly dull. I mean, by anyone's standards, it was incredibly dull. I was almost weeping with having to go through these endless lists of amounts paid and pounds and shillings and pence and how much the saddles cost and so on and so on. But every lord was running a major enterprise and would have been kept extremely busy. You know, the women tended not to figure quite so much in that part of the running.
There's a new... journal in Sweden called Historiskan. It's a new, I think the first number came, you don't know, of course. No. The first number came this year about historical novels, historical research.
Right.
And they mean that females, of course, women are underrepresented in these historical reviews. But they mean that if you raise the question, how did this war, how did this peace affects the family life, the ordinary life, the women and the men will be equally important.
Well, yes. I mean...
how do you look upon that?
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, before it affects the family, in my particular story, it affected Margaret, who became effectively a war leader.
Absolutely,
because, again, because of the absence. When her father, first very Freudian, when her husband had been removed and was taken away and held by his enemies, there was no one else. She was negotiating on her own and was then actually leading or being present with armies as they came down to retrieve her husband, which she did. I mean, she was hugely successful. There is one of the moments that you look for when she recovered her husband. So she had Henry back again with all of his totemic power, that she had the King of England in her grasp. She was the queen. She was with her son, who was at that point growing to manhood and was the Prince of Wales, and they had succeeded in every possible aim, and all of their enemies were dead. At that point, she had no idea who she had unleashed with Edward IV. Edward, Earl of March, as he was then, 6'4" and like a Goliath on the field of battle. But she didn't know that then. And she was heading south towards London, and London was so terrified of this army of ragged Scotsmen coming south that they closed the city gates and refused to let them in. So that the King, the Queen, and the Prince of Wales could not get into the capital city and were literally starving on the road. And that's her. That's not how did Margaret's family life, how was she affected on the domestic front? That's how she was affected on the field of battle. Because then the decision to move away into the north instead of waiting and maybe the doors would open, that was hers. And that makes her an interesting character. I mean, she wasn't known as the she-wolf for nothing. She was a powerful, difficult character.
Absolutely. In your first part of the Wars of the Roses, you have a long story about the Jack Cade.
Yes, Jack Cade.
Jack Cade, yes,
yeah.
who is a man of the people, you would say.
Yes, well,
who is an upright man, yes, in a way. But it has been a criticism about historical novels that they concentrate too much about wealthy people or noble family people or whatever. You have your Jack Cade in the first part,
well, it was
and
a major
here the second one you mention him now and then. But
yeah,
how
well,
do you look upon this?
How
do you look? Yes, of course.
I stopped mentioning the ones that
how do you look upon this criticism that it may be too much emphasis on
it is a style. I mean, there are what's the word, sort of threads or subgenres in historical fiction. Shakespeare used to write about the kings and queens because it meant that the stakes were the highest. It meant that countries could be won and lost. And I must admit, that appeals to me enormously. When Henry VI was weak, in return for getting Margaret of Anjou, he gave away 2 vast areas of France. And the French king rode into them and rolled them up, sending English settlers back to England ahead of them as refugees, so that vast thousands of people had to come back in rags with everything they'd owned taken from them to get into the English coast. And of course, he didn't stop where he was meant to stop. They rolled up English Normandy as well. And that meant that a huge wave of refugees came back into England at the same time, and some of them stormed London. And they actually reached the Tower of London and broke the walls in. The Tower of London, by the way, has no record of ever being breached, which is it's a little bit odd, because I found at least twice when they had the walls blown in by a cannon, but apparently that's not a breach. The point is, though, that if you write about the great kings and queens, you are dealing with the greatest of stakes, and then there's I prefer that, and so did Shakespeare, and if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me, you know. But Bernard Cornwell, for example, is an example of a type who, Hornblower was another, Patrick O'Brien, who would take a minor character who didn't exist and then write, his life, and to weave him or her in and out of the historical events, which is fine and lovely. And then what the joy then is when they meet a character and recognize them as Nelson or Wellington. And it's a pleasure. But for me, I prefer the stakes to be absolutely at the height, where countries can be won and lost, not just men and women's lives. And I can't regret it. It worked for Shakespeare, and so far I'm enjoying it enormously.
Absolutely, I see. We should soon end, but one last question. I think the name of this book in English is Trinity.
Yes.
It is in Swedish Solvarg, sun dog, I think.
Well, I'm very disappointed.
Just a moment, just a moment, my friend. It is, anyway, sun phenomenon in Swedish, I think, Solvarg.
Yes.
Sun, halo phenomenon. The word Trinity, of course, you have written a 3rd volume already.
There is a 3rd called
The
Bloodline.
Yes. But this second one, Trinity, with the 3 sons, in a way. You're seeing that the 3 sons in the last page of the book.
It's a
given
rare
to you
event.
by your son. There's your son.
Well, he suggested the name Trinity. The original name was
But did you think of Trinity in some other... I heard that you are son of a nun. Not every man has a mother who has been a nun, but Conn Iggulden has a mother who was a nun. Really.
Yes, she was a nun. Yes.
But did you have any connotations of the religious world, Christian world, when you choose the name Trinity?
It is something. It is having been raised by a nun, and obviously she stopped being a nun to have children. And the fact that my father was born in 1923 and his father was born in 1850. So I do feel that I'm very lucky, really, to write historical fiction and have a sense of the past, and to have a sense of how strong, for example, Christianity was in the 15th century, so that I can write characters who had strong faith and understand it. There is a dreadful tendency in historical fiction, for example, written today, to write a 15th century character and have somebody say, yes, but did Jesus really exist? And if you had said that sort of thing, then you would probably have been, killed. So I understand that a little better than some, I think, having, that rather old-fashioned upbringing in that way. But Sundog was what I originally was going to call the book, and I decided against it in the end. And now that you've called it Sun Wolf, I'm very disappointed, because I think it really would have been a good name. The sun reflected in 2 places. It's called parahelion in the scientific term for it. You can Google it. It's rare, but it does happen. And so you see 3 suns. And of course, Edward IV's soldiers thought that it was a terrible omen, and he reassured them and said, no, it represents the Holy Trinity. And they were reassured, and they went on to completely flatten an army at Mortimer's Cross in Wales, because Edward was a charismatic leader, and he led from the front, and he was taller and bigger and 18 years old when he got the news of his father's death, and really went quietly berserk for the next few years. And he was absolutely an unstoppable force.
A sign of God, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Well, everything was, considered to be an omen if you could make it. But then, Julius Caesar was doing that 2,000 years previously, when he was seeing lightning strike, or claiming to have seen lightning strike when he became consul. All you needed was a young man to run in and say, Consul, I've just seen lightning strike, and then you were guaranteed good luck and 9 vultures and this sort of thing. 8 vultures was not good enough, but 9, meant, that you'd be a really good consul. So he was quite willing and able to pay a young man to do something like that and run in with the news.
My friend, time is running
away.
away.
We'll have to stop.
Thank you so much for this. Thank you for coming here.
Yes,
Conn
thank you very much.
Ingulden. Thank you indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's all right. It's all right.